Since its inaugural year in 1979, the Bristol International Balloon Fiesta has grown to become one of the top 5 outdoor attractions in the UK, attracting over 500,000 visitors every year. We'll be taking a look at how this famous event began, how it's evolved over the years, and giving an insight into what makes it tick today. But first, over to John Penny for a special report on Bristol's proud ballooning heritage, which goes all the way back to the pioneering days of the late 18th century.
For local historians with a particular interest in local aviation, the annual Bristol Balloon Fiesta provides an excellent opportunity to take a trip back in time. It also gives us an excellent opportunity to imagine what it must have been like in the 18th century to witness the first manned ascent that took place from the city of Bristol. And what is even more remarkable is that modern balloons, using what is basically 18th century technology, still have the power to thrill and excite us, even in an area which for many years has been working at the cutting edge of modern aviation technology. Today, as we board our jet planes to whisk us off to exotic holiday locations, it would be interesting to know just how many of our fellow passengers are moved to recall the heroism of Jean-Francois Pilatre de Rosier and the Marquis d'Arlande, the first human beings to rise from the surface of the earth. This epoch-making event actually took place on the chilly morning of November the 21st, 1783, when the two intrepid aeronauts undertook a successful 25-minute flight across Paris in the world's first man-carrying hot air balloon, a device that had been perfected by the famous Montgolfier brothers. Not surprisingly, this remarkable achievement opened the way for a new and exciting chapter in the history of technology, and began a craze for anything concerned with balloons and ballooning that was to last for nearly 3 years. Unfortunately, a certain amount of jealousy on the part of English experimenters prevented them from making an early impact in the fledgling field of aviation, and consequently, it was foreigners who provided the British public with an introduction to the thrilling spectacle of ballooning. In Bristol, people had their first sight of a balloon when an Italian artificial flower maker named Michael Biagini exhibited a 30-foot circumference hydrogen-filled aerostat at the Cooper's Hall in King Street, where it remained for a 3-day period during January 1784. Unfortunately, it never actually flew, and the first local ballooning demonstration actually took place over in Bath on January the 10th, when Dr. Caleb Parry, a local physician, released a small demonstration aerostat, which eventually came down at Wells, where one Thomas Urch reinflated it with a pair of bellows and charged the locals twopence each to view the technological wonder. By a strange coincidence, James Dinwiddie, an itinerant Scottish lecturer in natural philosophy, also chose January the 10th, 1784, to release his large model balloon from Bath. But unlike Parry's, the wind took it in a westerly direction before it finally alighted on high ground in what is now the St George area of Bristol, a spot known ever since as Air Balloon Hill. Dinwiddie then moved on to Bristol, where at lunchtime on January the 24th, he gave Bristolians their first sight of a balloon ascent, when he released his 15-foot circumference aerostat from the backfields behind the Full Moon Public House in Stoats Croft, amid a vast concourse of people. At that time, a cluster of cottages being built in nearby Wilder Street were christened Balloon Court in honour of the event, and these survived until recent times, when they were swept away for the construction of the much more appealing office blocks known as Wilder House and Kenham House. A little later, on September the 15th, 1784, Vincenzo Lunardi, secretary to the Neapolitan ambassador in Britain, carried out the first manned balloon ascent in England, when he lifted off from London at the start of a flight which was to end with a safe landing in a field in Hertfordshire. The British public then went wild, and the ballooning craze in this country reached its peak soon after. However, it was some time before Bristol became the venue for a manned ascent, but finally, in September 1785, an 18-year-old youth named James Deaker announced that he had chosen the city as a starting point for his first aerial voyage. Consequently, at 3:45 p.m. on the afternoon of April the 18th, 1785, the daring young man ascended from a garden in Avon Street, St Philip's, today the site of an automobile workshop, to begin a 26-mile flight, which, due to a dangerously high wind, took just 32 minutes. Not surprisingly, young Deaker suffered a rough landing, and after being dragged along the ground for a considerable distance, was eventually disentangled from the wreckage and carried, battered but triumphant, into nearby Chippenham, where he was greeted with incessant cries of joy and approbation. Unfortunately, the death of Pilatre de Rosier, the world's first aeronaut, during a foolhardy attempt to fly from France to England in June 1785, brought Europe's ballooning craze to an abrupt halt. The outbreak of the Revolutionary War with France in 1793 and the subsequent Napoleonic War, which followed in 1803, also had a profound effect upon ballooning, and these long drawn-out conflicts ensured that few public balloon ascents were made in Britain until the threat of a French invasion had finally been lifted. As a result, it was not until September the 24th, 1810, that the famous James Sadler, a man often described as the father of English ballooning, chose the backfields in Bristol as a starting point for his 16th ascent. In the company of William Clayfield, a young Bristolian, they lifted off at 1:20 p.m. at the start of an eventful flight which took them past the spire of St Mary Redcliffe Church, across Lee Woods, down past Clevedon and over to Barry in South Wales, before returning across the Bristol Channel to make a landing on the sea off Combe Martin, from where they were rescued by the Lynmouth lifeboat. By the 1820s, the whole ballooning scene in Britain had changed, with the old professionals such as Sadler making way for a new generation of travelling showmen. Instead of using hydrogen gas to inflate their envelopes, something which had been universally employed by practically all balloonists except the Montgolfiers, they took to using the newly introduced coal gas, which was considerably cheaper. Bristolians were now able to enjoy the sight of fairly regular balloon ascents as the showmen came and went from the city, and this tradition continued until the latter part of the 19th century, when a new breed of balloonists began making scientific flights. Among these was the Reverend John Mackenzie Bacon, who on September the 12th, 1898, undertook such a flight from Clifton College School during a garden party held there to honour Bristol's hosting of a meeting of the British Association. A number of wealthy gentlemen also took up ballooning as a sport, and in the years leading up to the First World War often used Bristol Zoological Gardens as a venue for their ascents. As gas-filled balloons remained relatively expensive to inflate, private ballooning declined into relative obscurity during the decades following the return of peace. And it was not until 1960 in the United States that the heat given off by the controlled burning of liquid propane gas, conveniently contained in metal cylinders, was first used to inflate a modern-style hot air balloon. The technology quickly spread to Britain, where the British Balloon and Airship Club's Hot Air Group constructed the Bristol Belle, Britain's first modern hot air balloon, which made its maiden ascent on July the 9th, 1967. During this flight, the pilot, Wing Commander Jerry Turnbull, was accompanied by Don Cameron, a young Scottish engineer, who, in 1970, gave up his full-time job in order to begin building hot air balloons, an enterprise which has subsequently grown into the market leader that it is today. For an aviation historian, this is quite an exciting place to be, especially if that historian is interested in ballooning. For I'm standing outside of number 1 Cotton Park, Bristol, and this is the ancestral home, so to speak, of Cameron balloons. For it was here that Don Cameron first started manufacturing his first hot air balloon. And for me, this is a privilege, and it's very hard to believe that from such small beginnings, from such a tiny acorn, shall we say, that such a very large oak tree grew. And that oak tree, of course, is Cameron balloons that are now a worldwide concern.
This is the headquarters of Cameron Balloons, the world's largest manufacturer of hot air balloons, and a name that's synonymous with the Bristol Balloon Fiesta.
Well, I'm often asked how I got into ballooning, and I usually say that I put it down to drink, because it started in the bar of the Bristol Gliding Club, where a group of us, after much conversation, decided we'd build a balloon for fun. And it really came out of that. It seemed a good idea to build a few for other people, and then eventually set up Cameron Balloons, first of all in the basement of the house I was in at the time, in Cotton Park in Bristol, and then just gradually expanding as demand expanded.
So who were your early clients? How did you really get the business going?
Well, very much by informal contact, because ballooning was really unknown at that time, and the people interested in it were quite an international crowd, but a very select crowd. There'd be about 1 or 2 people in each country who were interested and who were corresponding with each other about balloons.
And obviously the most high profile event is the Bristol Balloon Fiesta. Now, how did you first start to become involved with that?
Well, back in 1978, I made a not quite successful attempt to fly across the Atlantic. We actually got within sight of the coast of France and were driven down by bad weather. But it achieved quite a bit of publicity, and I was a member of the junior chamber at that time. They asked me to give an after-meeting talk on it. Then we retired from there to the bar and once again got talking about things. And the junior chamber likes to organise various things for the benefit of the city, and it seemed a good idea to organise a balloon event. So it started there, and that also just grew from a fairly small beginning. Yes, the early ones had about 20 balloons, I think, and very little infrastructure, but it's gradually grown, and I think it's satisfied a need for a kind of trade show as well, because it attracts an audience different from some of the other events. It's very much a family audience. Of course, it attracts very big crowds.
The atmosphere here is really lovely. I think because we are essentially a family business that's grown very gradually over time. I mean, we know our staff very, very well. We're all together nearly all the time where we're working on the special projects or indeed on making hot air balloons throughout the year.
And I understand staff have to be quite versatile.
Yes, you do have to have sort of a sense of humour and be fairly flexible and, as you say, have a variety of skills. Because you can't learn this type of work anywhere else, and you have to sort of very often bring new skills to the factory, it's tremendous. You can use all sorts of things you've learnt before and then apply them to this wonderful lighter-than aircraft. It is very tricky to get new staff with particular skills. What we tend to do is a lot of placement training. So for instance, with machinists, we'd actually do on-the-job training where they do lots of practice work, and then they'd actually work on items that weren't specifically for the actual aircraft but were associated with it. For instance, like banner work, until they got up to being expert enough to work on actual aircraft. So we're here in the cutting department where they lay up a number of different